It is Halloween week across the Ontario Hockey League. Had the chance to see some of the crowd in Erie on the weekend. Some excellent costumes, including a member of the Average Joes from the Dodgeball movie. If you haven't seen it, it's great. If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. And I got to ride the elevator with one of the Average Joes. I also saw Michael Myers in the crowd. I should have stopped for a picture with Michael Myers because he is my absolute favorite. And it would have been great to put on our Instagram page, which I do a terrible job of using. So make a note of two things. One, we have an Instagram page. You can check it out at the OHL podcast. And I promise to try to do a better job with it. Okay. There's some stuff for you there right now. I'm going to get better at it. But Halloween week across the Ontario Hockey League. And unless you're in Peterborough, things aren't all that scary for your team, right? What? That was a bit of a drive-by. Shouldn't have said that. Dan Mahar on the other side of this call. Hey, who's your favorite horror movie villain, slasher, serial killer? And don't use a real one because that's not this kind of podcast, okay?
Yeah. Has to be Jason, doesn't it? This hockey podcast. He's got the old like Jerry Cheever's mask. I think we have to go that way, don't we?
Okay, that's not bad. That's not bad. I was always a Michael Myers guy, though. I mentioned him a moment ago, having seen him in Erie, but Halloween, that franchise was always my favorite. So I take a Michael Myers over a Jason Voorhees, over a Freddy Krueger, and over any of the modern day ones that all you kids out there happen to like. Okay. And by the way, just to finish the point, The Exorcist remains for me the best of all of the horror movies. And it's not just when Linda Blair's head is turning around, okay? It's when she does the spider walk down the stairs. Heaven help me. I just get chills thinking about it. So, All Hallows Eve is almost upon us. Let's dive into the information we have at our fingertips this week, Dan Mahar. And the first of which is a bit of a surprise report from Jeff Merrick, who is back online in a big way. Can't wait to hear where he's going to land broadcasting wise next. But Jeff Merrick reporting that the USHL's Muskegon Lumberjacks and Youngstown Phantoms were in, quote, conversations, and rather serious conversations, about joining the Ontario Hockey League. Obviously, it never happened. And Merrick says he's not sure what came of those conversations or where they're at today, but the conversations, Muskegon and Youngstown to the OHL, certainly happened. What do you make of this?
It's really interesting, isn't it? And when you actually think it through, it's not actually surprising because you got to put yourself in the shoes of the people in those centers that are USHL centers. And the second they hear about this NCAA change coming where CHL players are going to be allowed to play there, first thing you're going to get out of USHL and some of these tier two junior leagues in Canada is panic, saying we to sustain ourselves, we're potentially going to lose a huge pot of talent here because they have other options now. They're not being kept away from the NCAA if they play in the CHL. So first thing you do, if I'm in their shoes, is I make some calls to those leagues and say, you know what, our operating costs are not that much different. If we get into a league of that ilk, we could, bump up ticket prices. There's a market here. You start doing the math, do you not? I think you do due diligence. That's probably all this was. And if these are the first two to jump on the bandwagon, they want to get their foot in the door while they can, right? Before they're in a lineup of several other teams. I'm not saying there's going to be an avalanche of teams trying to join the OHL and the WHL and the Quebec League, but when Jeff reported this, it was news to me. It shocked me, but then the more I thought about it, well, yeah, I could see why this makes sense to them.
You and I are of like mind on this, Dan. That is exactly my sentiment when it comes to this reporting. And I think we will likely see more of it, not just the reporting, but probably some sort of consolidation, if you will, of leagues because of the very reasons that you just mentioned. The landscape is about to change rather significantly when this NCAA change happens. And teams in various leagues right now are looking for ways to uh, gain assurances about their future and their future health as a franchise. And is it any coincidence? I mean, I'm trying not to be too conspiratorial, but is it any coincidence that on the same week Merrick is reporting this, the Ontario Hockey League reports on an independent study that determined about $450 million in economic impact from the 20 Ontario Hockey League franchises in the communities in which they operate, not just the money that the franchises spend in those communities, but then the economic spinoff. In other words, it's a very good news story about how healthy the Ontario Hockey League is and the benefits, economically anyway, that it provides to the communities where it operates. Says I to myself as Marek's reporting this, and the Ontario Hockey League says, hey, over here, look at us. We're really healthy and make money in the communities where we operate.
Well, Mike, we talked a couple weeks ago about what impacts we would see from Brian Crawford now that he's in the big chair with the OHL, right? And I think we're already starting to see that in this vein, where I can almost picture myself in the boardroom as these discussions happen. Could you not? Where one of the first steps after assessing everything, Brian Crawford said, we don't necessarily do the best job right now of telling our story and promoting ourselves within the communities we operate in and within the province we operate in. So this is a strategic communications initiative, if you will, to kind of preach that and gain support from the communities that they operate in, as well as from the province, and position themselves as a real benefit to these communities. Because I think we hear all the negative. Anytime something negative goes down regarding junior hockey, we hear all about it. Anytime we hear challenges from the NHL about letting players play in the AHL, and these people that are very dismissive of junior, it was usually radio silence from the junior league. So I think what we're seeing now is a more concerted effort to say, no, we bring a lot to the table here. Let's start telling our story. Let's start preaching so we can position ourselves better for this oncoming train, we'll call it. I don't know if it's a train, but this heightened competition, this new landscape that's coming. They're setting themselves up for that.
Reporting like this gets people that are at least even halfways engaged in the game at this level kind of excited, starting to talk about various places the game could go. You and I, just a couple of weeks ago, Dan, were speculating on what we thought to be 4 relatively decent options in Ontario for the OHL to expand: in Burlington, Belleville, Cornwall, Chatham. And Dan sends an email. Our buddy Dan from Rochester writes to ohlpodcast@rogers.com regarding the OHL expansion discussion. I've always thought that Lake Placid would be ideal. There's an historic arena, a decent community with a ton of winter vacationers, and it gives Kingston and Ottawa a natural, easy travel eastern rival. That coming from Dan from Rochester via our email account. Don't ever hesitate to email us, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. Obviously, Dan from Rochester in New York State, looking at a place like Lake Placid, Muskegon in Michigan, Youngstown in Ohio. There's already an OHL footprint south of the border. Why not add into, and we talked about this the other week too, Dan, but into more of those U.S. states where it makes sense? I don't think the OHL would be shy of doing it, for sure.
Well, hey, Lake Placid came to my mind last week when we talked about it for a number of reasons. Obviously, the hockey history there, the setup they've got, a little bit remote in terms of the trip in. It's gorgeous, that drive, I'm sure, and it's fairly easy commute to Ottawa, to Kingston, Belleville. It's not that distant from an alignment standpoint. It does have that gorgeous arena. Lake Placid might have some challenges with the population there. It's not the most populous. A lot of tourist travel, a lot of tournament setups in that location. So there's some things obviously that have to work out, but it did cross my mind as a potential destination, and just one more to add to the list, right, Mike? Like, when we hadn't even considered Muskegon, we hadn't considered some of these other ones, but Lake Placid would have to be. I'd be shocked if it hadn't been in consideration at some point before. They've got a pretty neat setup there as is. There are tournaments every weekend, hockey schools every weekend. They've got a really thriving hockey scene there, so I'm not sure they necessarily see a need for an OHL team, but I'm sure someone has considered it.
We started this conversation a couple of weeks ago after a conversation that I was able to have, and you can hear that conversation because we've added it to our podcast channel with the new commissioner, Brian Crawford, who answered absolutely when I asked him the question if there's room for more communities to join this Ontario Hockey League. Absolutely was the immediate answer. I get the sense, and I'm going to see the commissioner again this week because his tour around all 20 markets brings him to Kitchener for the game on Friday night versus the Sudbury Wolves. So maybe we'll dive into this a little bit more. But it seems to me that we're arriving at a point of inevitability for expansion, as opposed to just possibility. We're into the probability conversation. And just in light of that, I'm going to throw out another possibility with this probability of expansion, if you will. And it's something that we didn't touch on and we kind of dismissed as much as we like the market idea, but we didn't go too far into it because logistically, we didn't think it would work when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. But I'm going to put Thunder Bay into the mix in Ontario. Yes, I know it's away north and travel would be an issue, but just consider again how in the queue right now, the conversation is for Acadie Bathurst to move to Newfoundland. And what does that look like? The problem has always been a logistic one, getting teams in and out. The travel would be expensive and maybe somewhat onerous. But as we identified when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, Thunder Bay does have a thriving U Sports market. Teams are traveling up there to play the Lakehead sports teams in Thunder Bay. What if there was enough corporate sponsorship / subsidy attached to this through Air Canada, Porter, WestJet, whatever airlines are flying into Thunder Bay, because it's a major metropolitan center, right? So if you've got some subsidy attached to that, the Thunder Bay team would obviously pay for the travel in, but they've got these corporate partnerships. You've got a nice arena up there, could use a little bit of work, but still, you've got a ready-made arena. You've got a market that draws really well, even for U Sports. And all of a sudden, the economic model might start to make sense. So I'll just leave it at this. Should these conversations in the Ontario Hockey League continue to move in the direction we think, and that is the absolute probability of expansion, don't be surprised if you hear someone with the stones to say, hey, Thunder Bay is a real possibility, and here's how we're going to make it work.
That's interesting. It ties into exactly what we were just talking about with how they're positioning themselves for government as much as anything about the economic development figures that are attached to the OHL. This is all started case building to build an argument. So, if we want to come to these communities, here's what we bring to the table, maybe help a little. And you reference subsidies around travel, potential arena upgrades. These are communities where, if you think of it from a political standpoint, you've got a provincial government that's trying to lure people to these more remote places. They're trying to spread the influx of new Canadians and other people to try and bolster these communities. This can be a piece of the strategy when you think about it. And for people that might shake their head and say, oh, it's just a junior hockey team. We're not talking about a major industry. Well, for communities like that, it is a significant industry, and it brings significant economic activity to the community. And these are all things that start to build a case for maybe we can make this viable with a little help.
Bingo. Well said. And I'll just add a little story to that political piece you mentioned. A long time ago, earlier in my broadcast career, I was working in Thunder Bay, and the transportation minister, the Ontario transportation minister, came up there to make a big announcement. And Dan, brace yourself, but they were going to twin, so expand to two-way traffic, southbound lanes and northbound lanes separated, twinning a highway going into Thunder Bay. Now, I'm from Southern Ontario, where we've got this thing called the 401, which is currently 12 lanes wide as a highway. Okay. It's massive. So I'm up there in Thunder Bay and I'm thinking, like, what the hell? Why is everybody so damn excited about the twinning? Like, big freaking deal, says I to myself. But to your point, it is a big freaking deal up there. And politically, it was a huge win for the Ontario government of the day. So something like this, providing these opportunities to a Northwestern Ontario community, et cetera, et cetera. So something to keep in mind, but you hit that nail right on the head, Mr. Mahar, when you talked about the political aspect of this as well. Are you running for office? Should we break that news on the podcast today?
Are you the member for Thunder Bay? Is that the seat that I should go for here?
Listen, if you want to, you could champion the OHL in Thunder Bay. That could be your campaign platform. We've got ideas happening here, Dansky. We've got ideas.
I mean, the alignment, you already solved the alignment issue for the OHL. You might have to go back to drawing board to figure out where Muskegon fits, but I mean, you did the work. So
I'll work with you, Minister Mahar. I will work with you on this. All right. Do you think the Sioux and Saginaw left their rivalry in the Western Conference semifinal last year? Zayne Parekh doesn't think so. And there's more than a 3-fight limit per player in the Ontario Hockey League. We'll get into that as we continue on this week's episode of the OHL podcast. You know that the quest for the Stanley Cup is now underway. The puck has dropped on the 24-25 NHL season, and you can get in on all the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NHL. Now, If you're a first time user and you're just getting started, do not worry about a thing. It's easy, and you can start with something simple like picking your favorite team to win. Just go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, select your team, and place your first bet. Just to show you how easy it is, because I'm not the most tech savvy guy, I'm going to do it right now. I've opened the DraftKings Sportsbook app on my phone. I'm going to go over to the NHL. I'm going to look for my favorite team, which sadly is the Toronto Maple Leafs. And they're playing on Monday night this week in Winnipeg. And the Leafs on the money line are a minus 110. Now, remember, I'm not giving you any gambling advice. Frankly, I'd stay away from the Leafs, but don't take my advice on this. I'm just showing you how easy it is to use the DraftKings Sportsbook app. The Leafs a minus 110 at Winnipeg on Monday. Click away and you've made your first bet. We want to make this worth your while too. So if you're new to DraftKings, pay very close attention. New customers can bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code THPN. That's code THPN for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. All right, let's take you back to the last week in the Ontario Hockey League. It's late in the game between the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds and the Saginaw Spirit, and Zayne Parekh takes Sault Ste. Marie's Owen Allard heavily into the end. Boards, Dan Mahar, have you dropped your pearls? You're not clutching them so tightly anymore to actually discuss this reasonably.
Well, with that intro, what else? What else are you going to do with it? No, I will admit that on viewing it live, hated it. Thought, no, that's got to be suspension incoming. Upon sober second thought, I will give Parekh some credit for. I do think he did hold up a little bit the last minute, realizing this is potentially dangerous, but he still completed the hit. And I will stick to my guns on it in the sense of completely unnecessary hit, potentially dangerous. Did not like seeing it at all. And I know a lot goes on over the course of the game, and I know Parekh takes a lot of stuff from the other way, and I think in legal terms that probably attaches the tag aggravated to anything that happens after that point. But no, it wasn't the most vicious thing you'll ever see, because there was no injury. There was a little bit of a let up, but way late, way unnecessary, vulnerable player. I think these are the types of things where we have to send a message to players like, do not complete these hits. And I think that's the message I wanted to see come out of that hit.
So we had you becoming a minister of transportation or sport and tourism when we talked about expansion. Now we've got you in a very senatorial way here in Canada, going to the sober second thought of our political upper chamber. I agree with you, and I will grant that this is the sort of thing that we would rather not see, certainly. But I saw upon first viewing that yes, there was a little bit of let up on the part of Parekh. And what I see as the danger the opposite way is a player completely trying to avoid the inevitable collision. And then what risk are you running to the individual? I'm not trying to, say just take runs at vulnerable players, because Allard was in a vulnerable position when Parekh hit him. But I did see, at least in my viewing, a little bit of let up on the part of Parekh. I think the officials nailed this one. It was a 2 for boarding and a subsequent 2 for roughing in the scrum that came from it, but no major penalty was assessed. What I saw happen here is Allard hit the brakes, and what he wanted to do, in my opinion, was throw the reverse body check on the Saginaw player that was bearing down on him towards the end boards. Sorry, I forget who that player was, but there's that collision knocking Allard off balance, and now he's kind of falling forward and twisting into the boards as Parekh would have been coming in. Again, everything's different at slow motion, but Parekh was coming in to go after that puck. Allard essentially put himself in a vulnerable position, and there was no contact to the head from what I saw. So ideally, do you wish that sort of thing didn't happen? Of course, but I saw Parekh let up enough so that it didn't look completely vicious to me. 2 minutes was more than enough on the call.
See, this is where I'm going to have to call you on it slightly, though, Mike. Parekh was not coming in to play the puck. This is the issue I had with it. The puck was long gone. First 2 players in, Saginaw defender, Sioux forward. collision. The Saginaw player gave Allard a bit of a shove, got him off kilter. Puck had long since gone around the net.
Yeah, but Allard's, he's trying to lay, you're forgetting that Allard was trying to initiate contact. He's trying to lay the reverse body check.
On a different player. On
Yeah,
a different
fine.
player. You don't when players are allowed to make that contact on a puck, some other player doesn't get to come in later and lay a second hit unless the puck is still there. Puck was long. I'm just saying I'm calling a little bit of BS on that one because Parekh knew damn well the puck was gone. He was trying to lay a lick on Allard. And yes, last second I think he did let up a little, realizing, oh, this guy's head over tea kettle here. I could injure him. So he just kind of gave him the shove. That's where I have a little leniency, but let's not try and pretend Parekh was making a play on the puck. That's my issue there.
All right, I'll grant you that. Fair enough. Puck had been gone, but can we just agree that we don't want a no-hit league, okay? Let's go. Come on. It's a full contact sport, please.
By no means am I ever going to suggest we want a no-hit league. I love the initial battle. I loved how that went down. I just, when you see a player in a vulnerable position, you got to let up, especially the puck's long gone. Let's just not have that. Was dangerously close to a cheap shot. And what I'm trying to eliminate are cheap shots. That's all I'm saying.
I would rather, if we're talking about Saginaw and Sault Ste. Marie, talk about the fact that at the time of recording this week's episode of the OHL podcast, the defending Memorial Cup champions from Saginaw have lost 3 in a row, and the Sioux has sorted itself out with 3 straight wins. How about that in the OHL's West Division?
We knew it to some extent, didn't we? Both you and I have a ton of respect for the Sioux, and they always figure things out. They always get things going. John Dean's a terrific coach up there. So they get their identity going. Their skating come at you in waves identity, and they figure out who's going to score goals for them. That seems to be the method. Every year it seems to turn over, and they invent new superstars every year. Not unlike a couple other cities in the OHL. London, we know them for that. So you know they're going to piece it together to some degree. That lineup just looks a little thin on paper, so you struggle to see how they're going to be in the top end, but we're seeing it right now, aren't we? They're turning around, they're figuring it out, and they're never easy to play once they do that.
Let's stay in the OHL's West Division because another divisional battle, this one between the Sarnia Sting and Flint Firebirds, featured, are you ready for it, 5 different fights. Sarnia's Dalen Moses, Dylan Luecki, Mitch Young, Ruslan Karamov, and Matthew Anderson all received 5-minute majors for fighting in that game versus Flint. And subsequently, Dan, the Sarnia Sting were assessed a $1,000 fine from the Ontario Hockey League. Please explain this to us, Minister Mahar.
So first, a tiny bit of context. The league did go back and review and has since reduced that fine to $500. I guess they determined one of those excessive fights was not really Sarnia's fault. They didn't instigate it.
It was Mitch Young who was instigated
Yes.
upon after further review. Correct.
That's correct, yeah. So that there was a little tweak in the fine. So the rule basically is your team is allowed 3 fights in a game, and after that, you will get fined $500 per fight. Same instigator rules apply, where if you're instigated upon, that does not count as one of the 3. But they're trying to eliminate, I would assume, these gong shows that happen where a team's down, there's a blowout, suddenly there's 6, 7 fights. They don't want that to be the look of the league. So they've set that threshold at 3, and whether you agree that 3 is a little light or too much or just right, who knows? But this was kind of news to us, Mike. I don't know if the penal system has been there and they've just now publicized it with this Flint Sarnia game, or if this was a reaction to some earlier games, hint, hint, Kitchener, Windsor, where they said, we can't have this happen again. League, here's a memo. You exceed this, we're going to fine you. Let's face it, the $500 fine isn't heavy per se, but enough for a team or a coach to say, okay, guys, let's chill. We've had our 3, we've had our 4. Let's avoid the nonsense.
Yeah, $500 per fight, I think, is significant enough. It had been $1,000 until they reviewed it and realized that Mitch Young was perhaps instigated upon. So it goes down to that $500 fine. And that's why Sarnia is being fined and Flint is not, because the Flint players, at least by definition of the rules, were the ones instigated upon more often. But you get to something, Dan, that I really like here when you're asking the question whether or not this is a response to that Windsor-Kitchener game that was a blowout in the first weekend of the season. And I think there were 6 fights in that game, if I remember correctly. But did the league act then, or is this a rule that's already been on the books? I can't say that I'm sure about that, but I will say this. What I absolutely love is that it was the league sharing this information and sharing it very publicly. You didn't pick up a report out of a newspaper report following the game or anything like that. The league publicized the fine and the reason for the fine, and then even went back and said, oops, we've reviewed this. We're reducing the fine from $1,000 to $500 because it was only one fight over the 3 fight per team limit. I really like this from the Ontario Hockey League, and I've mentioned it already this season on this podcast. I think there is an added layer of transparency that's been provided to fans and media in the league this year, and I'm here for it. And when I was going back over this, I started thinking to myself, there's a risk, and I understand the risk, if you will, of the league doing this, because you can easily realize that we're coming up on 24 suspensions total handed out so far this season. Teams being fined for having, are you kidding me? Like, let's talk about clutching our pearls again. 5 fights in one game. Oh my goodness, the travesty. We don't want this. It's the kids playing, blah, 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 blah. But this is the right thing for the league to be doing, in my opinion, without question, keeping people informed. The knowledge/information is power for the fans. Let us understand the game. And if I just add one more part to that, if it's been one thing that's frustrated me about hockey in general, not just the OHL over the years, it drives me nuts how often they're tweaking the damn rules. Like every year, there seems to be not just one little minor variance or anything like that. It's rule after rule after rule that gets modified, tweaked, changed, reverted, whatever it was. It's exhausting. But at least in this case, the OHL is keeping us abreast of if this is a change, or even just reminding us, hey, this is actually one of those many rules on the books in the league.
100%, right? And it's kind of two-pronged. It's the keeping us informed as fans, media, etc., which is great. Never complain about that. And then the other prong too is for their own purposes, their own PR, to say, look, we do have controls and measures in place to prevent this silliness and the nonsense. Because don't forget, there's a lot of people that have grown up with this league, and a lot of people that are old timers here that have been with this league a long time, and they'll remember things where you might not like to hear this, but there was this premise in junior hockey for years where everyone on the team had to get a fight in, and they tried to do it in the first third of the season, and there would be rookie fight nights where veterans would, in the warm-ups, would go to a veteran on the other team and discuss who was going to fight who and when, and all the rookies would get into it on the same night, and just all this kind of nonsense that was theater and part of I guess they considered it team building and character building, but optically it was really bad for junior hockey. So for people that have that image of junior hockey in their head and then see what it is today, the need to know that it's different and that things have changed and the league is taking player safety into account and doing things to make it a better league and less bush league, promoting it and releasing statements like this that explain what they've done to do that can only help the image.
I noticed on Saturday in Erie, the game I was covering, Matthew Lachar of the Kitchener Rangers and Jack Clark of the Erie Otters had a little conversation over by the penalty boxes during the pregame warm-up, and I didn't think much of it. I don't know their histories. I could have looked back and tried to find out if they crossed paths earlier in their hockey careers or whatever, but in the first period, they decided they were going to do the dance, and the Lineys, Ray King and Scott Lawson, were working that game. They got in there before the fight could even really get going. So I wonder if the officials noticed that little pregame conversation as well. I just bring that up connected to what you said, Dan. I'm not trying to say anybody's trying to fill an imaginary card in the OHL, but is it just me? Or does it seem as though fighting is up? I don't have any statistics to back this up. I'm looking strictly as an observer, but it feels to me like we're seeing more. That 6-fight game we talked about with Windsor and Kitchener, the 5-fight game with Flint and Sarnia, just the tips of the iceberg here.
And things got testy with Saginaw and London this weekend. So emotions are always going to be there, and you're going to see a little bit of that. But I think with the 3-fight limit per player before you start getting suspended, that's going to curtail a lot of it in the second half of the season. You're going to see teams get more interested in the standings and getting points on the board and actually sticking to hockey. So you're going to see a number of these players hitting that threshold before Christmas, and then it's going to die down. And that's kind of how it's been the last couple of years. And you talked about the linesman breaking up that fight in Erie last night. Well, they might have done Matthew Lachar a favor. That would have been his third of the year. So now he would have been on the clock for anything after that. So I'm not sure there's a need for these pointless pre-discussed fights you talk about. They're not heat of the moment. the game's boiling over, let's settle it down kind of fights. These are kind of, yeah, why not? Let's get one on the card here, right? So I think you will see that pace slow down as the season goes on, but you're absolutely right to this point, to the end of October. We've seen a lot. And it struck me last year too, and the year before, that a lot of fights were happening early in the season with this new fight limit. But I guess that's the mentality. These players, get them out of the way and then play hockey from then on.
I thought the same thing with regard to Matthew Lachar and that fight not being allowed to get really going in Erie, whether the Lineys knew it or not. They did Lachar a favor. 13 games into the Kitchener Rangers season, and he doesn't now, but he could have already had 3 fights on his card. All right, the Guelph Storm get a much needed boost, and Oshawa, well, didn't really need one, but the Gens get it anyway. Plus, everybody is doing the OA shuffle, and 62 OHLers are players to watch. We're watching prospects, of course, too, Dan and I. That's still to come on this week's episode of the OHL podcast. When it's time for the game, it is time for game time. I'll never forget my first NHL game. It was the Leafs versus the Hartford Whalers at Maple Leaf Gardens. It was better than Disney World to me. It really was. I couldn't believe I was actually in the arena to watch my favorite team play. Well, the Game Time app has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite team play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only the incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time sorting through thousands of tickets. And it's not just sports. If you love music, check Game Time for concert tickets. Everything is easier with Game Time because it's so user-friendly and easy to navigate. Plus, Game Time offers a lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection. And when you use the super deal, you'll find out how easy it is to save on the best seats. Game Time gives you all-in pricing, so you won't get hit with any surprise fees at checkout. And you can look at a panoramic view of your seat before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code THPN for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code THPN for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Dan Mahar, the Colorado Avalanche have returned Callum Ritchie to the Oshawa Generals, and the Philadelphia Flyers have set Jet Luchenko back to the Guelph Storm. Much needed in Stormland for sure. And the Oshawa Generals, let's just say TRGR, the rich get richer with that return.
Yeah, but to be honest, the Oshawa could use that boost right now too, because their start's been okay, but it hasn't been the world-busting start that many expected, largely because of these players missing and waiting and a lot of uncertainty. So now they can kind of close the door on that. They've acquired Barlow, the much-rumored trade. They get Ritchie back. They can start rolling now. And it looks like they'll piece things together. In Guelph, things have not gone smoothly. Badly needed Jet Luchenko back. All kinds of whispers he will be moved sooner or later for a massive package. So they got to figure out who the suitors are, what are the conditions, because Jet Luchenko, don't forget, is only an 18-year-old player, could very well come back next year. So whatever you do in a deal, you have to make conditions to get something fairly significant should he return next year. Which is also quite likely. I know he's stuck for his 9 games with the Flyers this year, but it doesn't mean he's a lock for the team next year. Oftentimes they do that to give the player a taste of pro, be around the NHLers, practice, learn from the coaches for a bit to go back. But they recognize these players really aren't ready for full-time roles in the NHL till they're 2021. So lots of moving parts there. The Guelph Storm badly need this boost though. Need some goal scoring, need some speed, need some leadership. So this is much needed for him. Whether they move him or not, having that asset back is huge for Guelph.
Excellent point on Luchenko, because I think many would forget, since he stayed with the Flyers for so long, that indeed he could, and dare I say even might, come back for a 19-year-old season. We'll come back to that in a moment. And that's, of course, assuming that Luchenko gets dealt. Nothing is guaranteed. But let's go back to what you said a moment ago about Callum Ritchie coming back to the Oshawa Generals, and maybe they do need that boost because it hasn't been the world-busting start we all thought of. You mentioned Colby Barlow's name. 3 points, Dan? Colby Barlow has 3 points in 10 games with this Oshawa team. Listen, I'll just say this. The Colby Barlow I saw as a rookie in this league, I don't think I've seen him since.
It's a bit of an elephant in the room there too, Mike. But I'm the same. I just loved what we saw from Colby Barlow as a rookie, and in his draft year in Owen Sound. Just this guy looked like he was going to light the world on fire as a 19-year-old in this league if he was even here. Just top end, but then something didn't go well last year in Owen Sound, and I kind of attribute it personally to issues off ice in Owen Sound with that team. Things weren't great. Cedric Guindon didn't look great. There was a number of players who we expected more from. So you thought, well, it's maybe just a team thing, a down year in Owen Sound. And it's early. It's early. So by no stretch is this a write off. I fully expect we'll see more from Colby Barlow. But first couple games, certainly not the standout play driving machine that you might expect as a 19-year-old. So there's some work to do there to get him up to speed. And maybe a dose of Callum Ritchie will be the trick. But we're not seeing full potential there yet.
Yeah, I think if you're an Oshawa Generals fan, you are hoping that the return of Ritchie leads to a little bit of a boost for Barlow as well. Okay, let's go back to Jet Luchenko and Guelph. And as I said, and you've agreed with, the Storm really need this boost. At the time of recording, 6 straight losses for the Storm. They're struggling up and down the lineup. They're also struggling at staying healthy. There's been an illness, there's been injury, etc. But Kevin Kurz, who is a Philadelphia-based hockey writer for The Athletic, has pointed out that he believes it's strongly likely that Luchenko will be moved to an OHL contender. Now, everybody's mind will immediately go to London because you want to talk about, a start that's not exactly the world-busting start that everybody figured it would be. And that's even after Barkey and Bonk and Cowan came back. The London Knights are still trying to find their legs in this 2024-25 season. So everybody thinks, well, if there's a trade rumor out there, London's going to be in the mix. But we know the balance of power is in the East this year. Are any of those East beasts going to be interested in the services of a Jet Luchenko? And I've been hearing a lot of rumblings about Barrie of late. We know they were in at least on the Barlow conversations, and people are talking about what a good team Marty Williamson has there in Barrie. Does Luchenko fit in there? I don't know. I'm just throwing out other possibilities. But to your point a moment ago, what does it take to get Luchenko from Guelph? And I mean, I know if you're a Storm fan, you're thinking to yourself, oh my goodness. Well, I'll get back to more of that in a moment. Because if they're struggling now and they trade the great piece they just got back, I think you can expect struggles to continue. I'll come back to that. But what does it take, Dan, to get Jet? Like, where are the starting offers for something like this?
Well, you got to figure it's a 2008 born, a first round player in that window, that it's eligible, or plus probably another body from the roster, plus a boatload of picks, 6 to 8 picks, depending on what rounds they're in. But then, if there's conditions on him coming back next year, what is that? Is that a couple more picks? Is that another body in the like a unwritten deal? It's a tough deal to make. But when you referenced all the teams, Mike, that might be interested. You have to think there's half the league, right? There's an awful lot of teams that feel like they're in the mix this year, and Jet Luchenko would fit like a glove in most of those lineups. So Guelph's in a good position from that standpoint. For all the Guelph Storm fans that are kind of rolling their eyes, saying, "Here we go again, another star out the door." This can be franchise making if you get this deal right. And I think with the number of bidders, they will. It's just that complication of him playing next year, like you referenced, and potentially wanting to get the deal done sooner than later so that you don't risk an injury to Luchenko. But if you do that, then you miss that window in January where you can get a 2008 born first rounder. So there's lots of complications to this deal to get done, Mike, but I would have to think that the preliminary discussions have already gone on and some of the suitors are starting to emerge because I'm guessing there's going to be at least 7 or 8 of them.
Would I be crazy to throw the Flint Firebirds into that mix? They made their moves in the offseason that we already talked about, but again, not coming out of the gates like a house on fire by any stretch of the imagination. We know they've got a bunch of picks they amassed last year. Why not make that part of the offer here?
I don't think it's remotely crazy. As a matter of fact, I think it's probable that they'd be one of the suitors for a lot of reasons. From an age standpoint of their core, they've kind of built towards this year to some degree. They're a bit of an older team this year, a lot of experience. They made a couple moves to pick up some key veterans to go for it. when we were doing our predictions, Mike, I looked at the lineup. The thing that kind of stuck out to me is, do they have enough goal scoring? Where are they going to find the goals for this lineup? And throw in a Javlichenko, and suddenly you've got a team that can contend, to my mind. I'm not sure that puts them over the top, but it puts them darn close. So I don't think it's crazy at all. I think it's probable.
One of our regular listeners out of Sudbury, while acknowledging he's still waiting for the musty mess to get sorted out, feel bad for the Wolves. They know it's a rebuilding year, but he put forward an interesting question, Dan, that I might be inclined to lean into here, and that is, what if what if in the Ontario Hockey League we only had two trade windows per season? That one that opens in the off season, and then maybe we close that in the first couple of weeks of September, or maybe the end of, I don't know. But anyway, the off season, if you will, trade window, and then the trade window around January the 10th, however long we make that, the weeks, the days after Christmas, I don't know. But the idea would be that you maintain some level of interest in the product on the ice in the first half of the season, because teams that are facing rebuilds know it's going to be a tough second half. But if Luchenko gets moved sooner rather than later, for example, and the Storm can make whatever decision they want. They can hang on to Luchenko till the trade deadline if they want to. But even all this speculation in the air might give fans a sense of, well, if they're just in the midst of a fire sale, maybe I don't want to buy my ticket to go to the game. I don't know, but I think it was an interesting enough talking point anyway.
It is, and there's some merit to it. Obviously, when you're talking about teenage hockey players in school, and you want to be careful about, you don't want these trade wins hanging over their heads and all these things of impacting team throughout the year. I know a lot of people will shake their hands and say, well, that's just silly. You can't put those types of controls. Teams need to be able to make trades when they want to. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things you could throw into the discussion. Like, well, what if a player is disgruntled and wants out? Does he have to wait till January? So maybe is there a secret portal through the league where agents can waive a player's right to wait for the window if he wants to be moved, and those players in that portal can be discussed. I don't know. There's lots of nuances there, but there is definitely merit to kind of putting a few more controls in place, because these things can hang over the heads of players and teams for a long time.
I think it's a great point about putting those kind of arbitrary controls around what a franchise does. It's the franchise's business after all. And I would still argue, as a massive, and I do mean massive, fan of the game at this level, I think you can always find a reason to go to the rink. Maybe it's a player on the other team. It's always a good night out, and it's relatively reasonably priced in markets across this Ontario Hockey League. So you can probably find a reason, and all things being equal, that your team's turn in the cycle should be coming back in another couple of years at least. But I certainly understand our friend from Sudbury's concern around this. NHL Central Scouting has released its players to watch list. 62 Ontario Hockey Leaguers, Dan Mahar, find their names on that early preliminary list.
A lot of players from the OHL, which speaks volumes about the league. And as always, there's always discussion about, wow, this guy should have been an A, this guy should have been a C. There's a couple players that I think will get a bit of a wake-up call and say, I've got to make things happen this year to boost my ranking. I look at a player like Tyler Hopkins in Kingston, very high pick into this league last year. Probably was expecting to be ranked higher than a C, and that's a wake-up call. You see that sometimes where players get a wake-up call and kind of kick in the pants and then start producing as they get into their second year. So we'll see how this early release of this list impacts the performance of some of these players going forward. But I certainly don't think there was any shock on who the A's were, Mike.
No, certainly not. Brady Martin, Porter Martone, Michael Misa, Matthew Schaefer, Malcolm Spence. I'll tell you what, I put Spence and Schaefer down just because I got a chance to watch them back-to-back games this past weekend. And Matthew Schaefer particularly, Dan, in his first action of the season. And remember, he's coming back from mono, which is debilitating enough in and of itself. He stepped back into that Erie Otters lineup and into this league as if he'd never missed a minute. He might as well have been in game 12 for the Erie Otters, too, from the moment he stepped back on the ice. What a gifted player this young man is.
Well, I believe he scored the first goal in his first game back in Barrie, did he not? I mean, this silky would be a word. I mean, you can look at different adjectives to describe this guy. And it's not to say these players make mistakes. There's 17-year-old defensemen in the league make mistakes, and he will, especially offensively inclined guys. but the skating is just phenomenal. His ability to move laterally on the blue line to get his shots through. And we've seen a couple goals he's scored already this year, and his limited action have been on those sneaky wrist shots from the point where he found lanes. Just a phenomenal player. You can see how high Hockey Canada thinks of this guy, and lots of suggestions he could go top 5 in this NHL draft. So we'll see how the rest of this year goes, but just what a player.
Just his third game of the season, and I don't have a clock on him, but I'll bet you he went 30 plus minutes in that Saturday night game on home ice versus the Kitchener Rangers. From NHL's Central Scouting, players to watch, I'm just going to mention these teams that we're watching, Dan. I'm not going to go further than that. You can go as much further as you want to go. I'm just going to put it out there. Last season on this podcast, we were talking early, and it is still early, but it's getting late quick, as Yogi Berra would say. It gets late early around here, I think is what Berra said. Last season, early season, we were talking about both the Kitchener Rangers and the Peterborough Petes doing things that we did not expect them to be doing. They came back to earth in the second half. This season, those two names or those two teams are on my mind again. I'll remind you, it's early, but for different reasons. The Kitchener Rangers have just extended their point streak to 11 games with 6 consecutive wins after their opening weekend losses, both in regulation. Kitchener has not lost in regulation in the 4 weeks of play since then, going 9-0-1-1. On the other side of that ledger, it's an 0-9-1-1 for the Peterborough Petes. Give them credit for battling and getting to a shootout against Brantford this weekend. They're in action against Oshawa tonight on the day we're recording. However, it's no wins in 11 games for the Peterborough Petes, on pace, even if they beat Oshawa tonight, for a 6-win season. It's bleak in the Liftlock City. Any further you want to go, you can, but I think these teams are on our radar for a reason.
Yeah, so I'll start with Peterborough and just say, kind of as we predicted, you're gonna have to give this time a little bit, our squad a little bit of time. We'll see what impact Gavin Bryant has when he gets into that lineup. There's a few positives looming, and I think one of them is we've seen young players like Aiden Young doing a lot of the right things so far this year, but not getting rewarded. So nice to see him have a 2-goal game this week. Once things start clicking for the younger players, you see the ball gets rolling downhill. So there's some silver lining on the horizon there for Peterborough. On Kitchener's side, I think the biggest difference for me is something I was harping on all last year. I found the team a little bit undersized and soft, getting out muscled, getting beaten down. They added some big bodies this year, some guys that can work the wall. And dare I say, the last few games I've watched, they were the stronger, more physical team. They were winning the puck battles. They were pushing the opponent around a little. So that's a huge difference. I think what Kitchener's trip will be two things. One, in the second half, can they keep it up when other teams really start to ramp up and you see a scoring out of a player like Adrian Misljevic? We saw that dry up last year. Can he continue? And the other thing, too, is Kitchener has a number of really high-end, smaller, younger players injured right now. Evan Hedrick, Avery Ansis, Cameron Arquette. When these players get healthy and come back into the lineup, which you need to play these guys, they're your future, but they don't bring that dynamic that's working for them right now. So who comes out of the lineup? Does it shift the look of a team? Do you eat some more losses now for long-term gain? So those are things to watch in Kitchener longer term.
You mentioned Gavin Bryant, and I referenced earlier everybody doing the OA shuffle. Niagara solves its OA situation. They're keeping Loshko. They're keeping Van Vliet. They're keeping goaltender Owen Flores. Their captain, Gavin Bryant, goes to Peterborough, which now has an OA problem of its own. And Alec Leonard, curiously, ends up in Owen Sound after the attack already released Tejas Jordan, an overage defenseman, but Alec Leonard will come in and fill that gap in the Scenic City.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? This shuffle, because you think teams are set. You know, Tejas Jordan released because of the numbers game. Then you get Connor Smith with an injury that's going to keep him out 6 to 8 weeks. And you think, well, 6 to 8 weeks, that's not season ending. So maybe you just sit on that spot for a while. They decided to act and bring in Alec Leonard, but they kick the can down the road, I guess, in terms of that OA problem. They're going to have to solve once Connor Smith's back, unless they have some information about the injury that's longer. Who knows? Maybe they have a trade lined up. They've had some interest. They know what they're going to do. But it's a curious move there for sure to fill a gap that was going to be 6 to 8 weeks in nature. But the shuffle continues.
And Peterborough is going to have to make a decision now that they bring Bryant into their fold there. And as we've already alluded to, Not the start to the season that anybody was hoping for up in Peterborough. Okay, one more piece of business for us to take care of before we get our houses haunted and ready for trick-or-treaters on Thursday night, and we play the game, one for you and two for the person handing out the candy. At least that's the way I do it. Dan, who is your prospect of this week?
Well, Mike, I'm going to dip over to the Eastern Conference for my first import selection of the year, and that is Philip Ekberg on the 67s. And I quietly kind of adding a little bit of offense to that team in a year when they're trying to recoup some from losses in the offseason. 6 points in his last 5 games, kind of quietly sliding in behind the Luca Pinellis and adding some of that secondary scoring there. So he won't wow you in your first couple viewings, but does a lot of things right, like a lot of players from that area of Europe tend to do. It'll be interesting too because we're seeing different dynamics with the imports now, where they don't always stay and play 18 and 19-year-old years. They kind of get some experience in the CHL for a year or two, and then once they're 19 or 20, look for other leagues to play against men. So we'll see how long Philip Ekberg stays here, but promising start for him in nation's capital.
Love it. I've got a player as my prospect that you've already made reference to, and in part because of his C ranking there on that NHL Central Scouting players to watch list. Tyler Hopkins in Kingston picks up a 4-point night, 2 goals, 2 assists in a win over Peterborough. Look, they all count, and no matter how much the team is struggling, this is a quality league, so 4 points is nothing to sneeze at. But what really stood out to me is that these 4 points go alongside 2 other multi-point games, a 2-point effort and a 3-point effort for Hopkins, meaning 9 of his 11 total points have come over just 3 games. So the big knock and that kick in the pants you mentioned earlier, Dan, would have to be consistency. I loved Tyler Hopkins when he came into this league. His inaugural media interview was one of my favorites after he was drafted by Kingston last year. I think this kid's got a ton of upside. His defensive game has been improving. What everybody is going to want to see more of is that consistency. But the 4-point effort is good enough to get a nod of prospect of the week from me to Tyler Hopkins.
Great call and timely too. And I think we all know Tyler Hopkins himself knows he's better than a C-ranked skater for this draft. Not that there's anything wrong with the C. There's a great crop of C-ranked skaters. But I think Tyler Hopkins is one name that jumped out to me, as I wouldn't be shocked to see him ascend as the year goes on.
Enjoy some scary movies. Enjoy a sugar high. Don't forget to steal some of your kids' candy because they don't need it all anyway. And check back with us in a week's time. You can find Dan on Twitter or X at Dan Mahar, his name. I'm at Farwell_OHL. Give us a like, subscribe, tell a friend about the OHL podcast, and feel free to send us an email anytime. OHLpodcast@Rogers.com. We're back in your ears next week on the OHL podcast.